Welcome on, everyone. You have reached the town hall on high impact practices with a focus on equity. I'm Stephen Dandino, the Executive Director of UERU, which is our abbreviation for the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities. We dropped that A and we just pronounced the letters UERU. Welcome. We have over 500 registrants for today's town hall, which will last 90 minutes in total. We're going to just, move into this a little bit slowly so we give folks a chance to transition from whatever they were just previously doing in order to join us live for this important discussion. As you know from our promotion of it, this is a program roughly divided in half, where we'll begin with a conversation between George D. Kuh, who you all know from his years of work in higher education research and leadership. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Higher Education Emeritus at Indiana University. He comes to us from Bloomington today. And he's also the founding director of the National Survey of Student Engagement, NSSE, which we all use and benefit from in our work in higher education. And also the founding director, as I think everyone knows, of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. He and Bethany Usher, who's Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education at George Mason University, and the 2023 and 24 President of the Council for Undergraduate Research, Kuh, who again, we all work with, know very well on our respective campuses. They will take the first 45 minutes or so for conversation about high impact practices today with a focus on equity, and then we'll transition where we have 5 wonderful colleagues from research universities, coast to coast, north and south, who will be talking a little bit about high impact practices on their campus, lots of different perspectives there. And I'll introduce those folks right before we hear from them. And then we'll conclude, wrap things up and try to synthesize what we've learned today. Let me just touch on a few technical issues while people are joining us. We're already up to 250 folks joining, and we're just delighted that you're here and taking time to join this conversation. I mentioned the structure. I want to emphasize that we will have some time for Q&A, and we're going to use the Q&A function on our Zoom webinar for those specific questions that you would like Bethany and George to address. Please feel free, however, to use the chat if you'd like to introduce yourself or just comment as the town hall proceeds. You're very welcome to do that. We will monitor that as well. But for Q&A, let's use Q&A today. Make sure you're muted and all that sort of thing. Appreciate that. Know that we are recording and plan to post this recording to our My UERU site and otherwise make it available for folks who would like to benefit from the town hall but aren't able to join us currently. This all is leading toward, believe it or not, here we are, August 1st. We're looking ahead to the new academic year and the fall term beginning for some of us pretty soon. I don't mean to startle folks by mentioning that, but I know you're all aware of that. And here at UERU, or just this morning, we sent out a call for participants and registration information for our national conference, which will be November 14th through 16th. In Arlington, Virginia, and at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I mentioned that because this conference is partly sponsored by NAC, who's also helping us with this town hall today, and we're appreciative to NAC for that platinum sponsorship for our national conference, along with Sloan Foundation and other sponsors as well. Well, I see that we're about at 280 participants. So without further ado, I think we should transition to our opening conversation between Dr. Kuh, George Kuh, who you know, Bethany Usher, who you should know from George Mason University, and the incoming president of Kuh. Let me turn it over to Bethany.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. And I am excited to be able to talk today. I'm honored to be able to be talking with George and with everyone who's here today. And I actually want to be able to help with George to be able to set the set the groundwork for high impact practices. It's a term we all use, but you're the one who coined it. Can you start a discussion by defining what HIPs or high impact practices are and highlighting what the important features are?
Well, I'd like to take full credit for coining the term, but truth in lending here, Carol Gary Schneider, when she was the president of AAC&U back in the day, she and I went back and forth multiple times about what we ought to call these unusually educationally effective practices. And I was using gunky terms like educationally effective, and back and forth we went. So I'll claim to be the final arbiter. Yeah, we call them HIPs, high impact practices. We bumped into these in the night at Indiana University. The original data set, as some of you may know, came from the National Survey of Student Engagement. We had a set of early questions on the NESE. We call them enriching educational experiences. And they were things, not that we pulled them out of the air, but there was a lot of positive vibe around things like study abroad, writing intensive courses. People who do those, of course, claim that they are particularly powerful. Service learning had a fair amount of research by the 2000s in terms of demonstrating its effectiveness. So we had 6 of these items on NESE. And one day I said, in my infinite wisdom, to the data crunchers, the people who are a lot smarter than me at the IU Center for Post-Secondary Research, let's just take a very close look. And bottom line is, from 2006 and 2007, both of those national years of data showed that if a student did one of these high impact practices, they benefited to an unusual degree. I'll talk a bit more about that. In the chat box, I hope Mariah has placed a couple of links to things that are descriptive of these practices. Perhaps everyone is tired of seeing this list. I call it the officially approved list of HIPs. And you don't have to go too far down the line here to see inquiry and creative activity. That's my phrase, which encompasses undergraduate research, a little bit broader, but because that's the focus today. So you can take a look at that link and you can see how they've been defined if you're not familiar with them. The first 10 appeared in the first publication, the 2008 publication, and then ePortfolio. There was a fair amount of good research being done, and a few years ago that made its way onto the list. And I talk about these as being officially approved, and I'll come back to that point later, because I'm confident that there are other things that students do while they're at university that can have similar kinds of effects, right? So what's all the buzz about? What's the hype? Well, if the student does one or more of these, as I've said, they are more likely to finish what they start. And each additional evidence keeps coming up about the outcomes that they achieve as a result of this, which separates them in quite distinctive, statistically significant and practical ways from students who don't do these things. Very important for our times. And we saw this from the very beginning. Participating in a HIP has these salutary effects. Students who come to college less well prepared academically, they may be first in their family, maybe low income, maybe from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. Often we say, unfortunately, these are the at-risk populations. Well, they get a bump from their participation, and they often rise to a level that is beyond what is predicted from our typical measurements in terms of academic achievement and persistence and such. One of the things we don't talk about, I do a lot, is this third bullet. If you participate in one of these things, you get to know faculty members better. You get to know a set of peers. Oftentimes, it's an affinity group that you might not otherwise be a part of. And so the sense of belonging increases at a place, shrinking the psychological size, as I like to say, which is particularly important at large research university, is it not? And then these kinds of experiences give students a chance to get their hands murky and muddy and dirty. How does this stuff actually work, right, in the real world? Almost all of these practices, those 11, have input on that. And finally, it turns out the more HIPs one does, the greater the benefits, these cumulative additive effects. Now, there must be some upper limit. I mean, if a student tries to do 12 or 15 of these, they're more likely to burn out, right? But what we do know is 2, 3, 4 are far better than just one. Is good, and especially one in the first early in the academic experience. But 2, 3, 4 is better. And there are some other things that we have fewer data about, but increasingly, I think people are demonstrating their policymakers, employers in particular. If you let your eyes just run down these 3, what I call sets of dispositional attributes, being able to communicate effectively with people and also understanding what they are saying, why they're saying it, what the impact is. These intrapersonal competencies, employers continue to be astounded when students don't seem to be able to show up on time. But some of these words, resilience, getting quite a bit of buzz in the educational literature, pre-K through post-secondary, and this last set, the so-called neurocognitive competencies. The crystallized stuff is what you take away from my lecture. The fluid intelligence represents what it is you can do as a result of what you've learned here. That is managing and adjusting, modifying what it is you think you know to a certain type of new experiences. Now, I have said from the very beginning, and by the way, I should mention at this point, just off the press at Stylus Publications is a book, the title of which I now cannot find. Oh, no, it's Delivering on the Promise of High Impact Practices. And there's a fair amount of multiple chapters from people from all over the country. And one of the great emphasis in this book is doing HIPs well. So just because we label something, right, service learning or internship or study away, study abroad, or undergraduate research, it doesn't necessarily mean that this particular experience has been designed and implemented and experienced by students at the highest level. And so where do we look to know whether we're doing HIPs well? So in the chat box that Mariah has placed is the second resource here, which goes into much more detail than I'm going to now about what makes a HIP, essentially. And you can let your eyes run through this list. I'm not going to spend time talking about it. We can come back if you like and talk more about this. Well, I would like to talk about it, but I'm not. I'm just going to go down to
we'll have more time.
to the very last one, or the last two, because I think demonstrating what one has learned and can do as a result of having had an undergraduate research experience. Well, how does that happen? It doesn't happen in the dark of night, right? It happens when students have an opportunity to talk with their co-researchers and present their work, right, in a public, quasi-public forum. But this last bullet is very, very important here. A HIP doesn't have the kind of maximum optimal impact unless we get students talking over time about what's happening to them during and as a result of this experience, and asking them questions about how they're using what they know in other circumstances. And finally, for now, as I've already said, this officially approved list, I mean, I think of the other things that go on a research university campus. I mentioned some of these things, kind of internships and so forth. Those are on the list. But what about, heaven forbid, participating in intercollegiate athletics under the right coaching philosophy? How much students might learn. Participating in the cultural and performing arts, writing for a university publication. And for our friends at NAC, we've got some terrific, very impressive data now about the power of peer tutoring, and especially as it is ramped up with technology as NAC does. and you see a tremendous scaling effect. And we'll talk more about the importance of equity. The second point here, what makes a HIP a HIP? Well, if you go back to that previous slide where you've got, I think we've got 8 kind of core features, these tend to be bundled in a high impact practice. And most important of all, probably, as we think about these practices and the elements, the features that make them up, we can be using this in any classroom, any lab, any studio, and also in out of class activities, the importance of setting high expectations, ongoing feedback for students, and the reflective activities. So I've not spent a lot of time talking about, you've noticed, research, undergraduate research, and research universities. And I'm kind of hoping, you know, that Bethany will kick us off there in her role as the incoming president of the Council of Undergrad Research. So is undergrad research, Bethany, a model high impact practice? Please wax eloquent for us on that.
I don't know if I can wax as eloquently as you have here, but I believe that it is, and especially for the institutions that are represented here, because one of the things we can think about is, as research universities with an educational mission also, undergraduate research helps undergird, I think, all of the other kinds of things that we think of. And I love the idea of thinking about this as an ecosystem of high impact practices, not necessarily just by definition. It's interesting because undergraduate research as a term really began to be used in the 70s and mostly by faculty at predominantly undergraduate, predominantly white institutions as ways for faculty to be able to maintain a research agenda while they had a high teaching practice. But at the same time, one of the foundational elements of a university education from the time we started having, university educations was that mentored sort of inquiry experience. And so without a term, that's been sort of the foundation of the high impact practices that universities have done. As we were thinking through the 70s as a term and the idea of this, for a while there, undergraduate research was thought of as being a mentored one-on-one activity, often for the highest performing students, and being used, often science-based, to be able to identify students who are going to be sort of the next level of professors, right, as a way of being able to help students get into graduate school. But in the past, I think 10 to 20 years, really starting with some research that was done at the University of Michigan by Sandy Gregerman and her team, we really began to get a much bigger view of the fact that undergraduate research, especially as it's broadly thought of, was really useful for students from underrepresented groups to be able to maintain the kinds of student success, before we were calling them student success markers, keeping them in school, creating communities, and starting as they started college, not an expectation that this is something only for students who were well-developed and able to produce. And so it's become clearer that there are benefits for students and faculty, that being more inclusive has benefits for both students and for faculty. And a couple other things I would say, I really do think this is foundational for research universities. The official Kuh definition now has changed over the years, and it says, it's a mentored investigation or creative inquiry, reflecting your language, conducted by undergraduates that seeks to make a scholarly or artistic contribution to knowledge. And one of the things I've done in my informal work has always said that if faculty do it and it counts as scholarly activity for faculty, then appropriately scoped for undergraduate, it counts for undergraduates. And that means that it can be integrated in study abroad experiences and in first year experiences and writing across the curriculum and all of that. And so our goal is really to be able to say, especially as research universities, this is the connection for all of them, a Venn diagram rather than a set of different activities as you talk about. So from there, though, we talk a lot about inequities in how we are are really, I think, shifting in a lot of our institutions to think of these activities rather than being special kinds of activities, to being able to think of them as inclusive. And I've talked a little bit about that with undergraduate research. How do you see that with HIPS in general, the shift towards a more inclusive environment?
Well, I passed over too quickly probably the salutary effects of HIPS, right? Bottom line, everybody benefits who participates. There's work coming out now for us to be a bit more mindful of what might be less than subtle differences in terms of how some groups experience certain kinds of these activities. Undergraduate research, for example, if there's one, for example, person of color in a group team, is that person getting the same kind of, I'm talking about qualitatively important benefits? The data we have from a distance suggests, generally speaking, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So what's one reason why I'm quite bullish on it.
Right.
And we're gonna talk. Maybe this is the point.
Right.
The Boyer Commission report has a big. I haven't seen it,
Right.
and it uses terms. It's not for example, it's not the AAC&U term inclusive excellence, but I think it means exactly the same thing, I suspect.
Right.
So it is an embarrassment that even though we've known about these positive effects, that the gaps on most campuses continue to exist. And what's the solution, Professor Kuh? You require participation in a high impact. I've said this to colleagues. I'm trying to strike the word opportunity out of my lexicon because opportunities are vacuous. They mean nothing unless a student actually participates. And requiring a HIP is not as far out of line as you might think. In fact, I think it's unfathomable that you can actually have a degree ending at a research university where a student does not have a culminating experience that has some depth of inquiry to it. We all kind of push back here. We don't have the resources and so forth and so on. But that's how you reduce the inequities.
At George Mason, we're a majority, the term of this is difficult, majority minority institution. And one of the things we found is the idea that these things are credit bearing has been really important for being able to keep equity at front, being able to help students so that instead of these being the kinds of activities that only some students do, if you build them into the educational experience and scaffold them across, then students start thinking it's for me, because part of this isn't just whether or not faculty are included, but whether or not students recognize that these are inclusive practices for them. So being able to think about building it into classes and making sure there's credit, so you're not expecting only the students who can devote extra time to it, and then being able to say that you've got the skills to be able to participate. So building into the common intellectual experience, building into the writing, building research in, and letting students know that this is in fact research. One of my favorite quotes is from the book Engaging Ideas by Bean. And he writes something that's really helped me think about how to think about student research and within a course. He said, going to the library or library portal is only part of what happens when many disciplinary professionals pursue research. The term research paper conveys to our students the going to the library part, but leaves out the critical inquiry part. And so this, as you're talking about it, the intentional design in our curriculum to be able to not only build critical inquiry in with the reflection and all of that, but being able to tell students that's what they're doing so that they recognize themselves as scholars, through all of these kind of high impact practices. I think for, especially at research universities, is sort of fundamental to making students feel included in there. So I think that's really important. And that we do get critics, though, that say that this is not, that this should be sort of reserved, or they're welcoming students, but with a deficit bias. Do you hear such things, either straightforward or surreptitiously, that who can do them?
I don't hear them,
Mhm.
but I see them. I mean, I don't know of an institution that doesn't have something, in its mission and stated educational purposes and even strategic plans that will trumpet to the world that all students can learn anything here. And I'm not saying there's a wink
Right.
in there. So while the words matter, the data matter more.
Mhm.
As I've already mentioned, the gaps that exist on most campuses
Mhm.
in major fields, as well as participation in these high impact practices. We're long past the time when we can afford to allow such practice, such
Mhm.
culturally embedded practices to
Mhm.
exist, right?
Well, from the data, George, I mean, you're looking at it. How can institutions use their data to be able to identify? And you're right, most institutions are want to be inclusive. How can the kind of data that we collect be used for people to understand what kind of structures are underlying the things that include or exclude students from high impact practices?
Well, money can have a factor, but I mean, the simplest way to answer for me,
Right.
is to do a campus audit
Mhm.
and find out. And now this is a lot easier said than done, and then we got to go back. Speaking of done, it's a
Mhm.
matter of trying to determine up close and personal how well the particular activity has been experienced by students, how well it's been
Mhm.
implemented. Then I go back to the kind of list of 8 features, and are we
Mhm.
clicking on all those? I just
Right.
want to say, uh, it it's not easy work, but it's necessary work. I
Mhm.
do want to say one thing more about campuses that seem to be, well, and in public policies that seem to want to track students into some instances less than baccalaureate degree experiences. I
Mhm.
wrote a piece for Harvard Business Review a couple 3 years ago online, which I think 4 or 5 read. But my observation is the people who sometimes speak the boldest about the need. And by the way, I think apprenticeships, are right on the money. But when you have short-term training and you say that will be the fix we need,
Mhm.
that disadvantages groups once again in
Mhm.
certain unacceptable ways. And the people who tend to speak the loudest about these are the people who want their own offspring to go to university and
Mhm.
get a 4-year degree. Yeah.
No,
So,
I
do we have any more time, Bethany, for you to wax eloquent? I'm very curious about how we use the virtual environment uh,
I
to implement, as more and more people, more and more institutions are using more and more virtual platforms. What does it look like with regard to undergraduate research?
It's a really interesting question because at first, and again, it goes back to that equity issue because for, I think, pre-pandemic, there was definitely an expectation that kind of online programs were streamlined. And I think there were some differences in who they kind of who we as institutions expected would be in online programs versus face-to-face. And there was not much scholarship about how we offered high impact practices in online environments. And I think the pandemic has shifted that considerably. There are already really good models for things like use of shared data for students to be able to work on shared, sort of projects, either community-based projects or shared projects. But since then, the ability to be able to do mentoring online, to be able to offer projects, I think people have gotten much more creative. The Kerr publication, the Spur publication, actually turned a couple of the issues into case studies on how people were doing online undergraduate research. And again, I think that it brings out the things that we know are our strengths in some ways. The one thing we often talk about is whether or not research needs to be high impact, needs to be one-on-one.
Mhm.
But one of the things we're learning is that the community-based aspect of it, either because very little research we actually do is ever really alone or one-on-one. labs are research communities, students who are able to do research that they understand how it affects their community, or approaches like the UN sustainability goals or the grand challenges, that they see themselves in a larger community of scholars, helps students who may not be from an individualistic kind of social background to be able to participate. And online actually facilitates that kind of work. I don't think it's mature in the same way that sort of we know the ways we can categorize undergraduate research or some of the other things, but I think it is certainly moving there very quickly. And there are some really good models to be able to do this that don't stigmatize, but actually use it as an asset. It's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm as curious as to the answer as probably anybody else. So if you're designing a course-based research experience for students, how does one go about that? What does a really good one look like?
There are two kinds of answers to that. One is there's sort of a body mostly in the sciences, right? And this is something that's been facilitated by AAC&U, of CURES, course-based undergraduate research experiences, which it can be very sciencey. One of the things we've seen working nationally is that one of the mistakes people make is they expect that in a single course, a student will be able to do everything, like design a question, collect data, find the right research methods, analyze it, and present it. And it turns out that students, especially we found that students who do this sometimes concentrate in the wrong area, right? The research methods are hard. And so they collect data and work on their poster a lot, and they don't necessarily do that. So one of the things is that intentionality. We'll wrap it around to what you talked about in the beginning. Thinking about how do you design an experience where you're holding fast, like if what you want your students to do is really dig into the research methods, then making sure they've got a data set already set so that they're working on that. So you think back to what your goals are going to be. I also think that sometimes people think that it's not equivalent to a one-on-one research experience. It may not be, but I think that but that's not bad. It's a different set of outcomes. And so students can still form close relationships with faculty and peers in being able to work on this. Again, it goes back to that community. So I think setting expectations of what the outcomes are going to be for a course-based experience versus a sort of individualized, and understanding that that's a continuum and not 2 points. And like I said, I think about so many of the things that are listed as high impact practices. Community-based learning should be research-based, and a lot of study abroad can be research-based, that these things should be integrated and not thought of as separate kinds of experiences. And I see Steve leaning forward. It looks like it's time for us to take some take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, Bethany and George, thank you. We do have quite a few now that are populated in the Q&A function. Just want to thank the over 300 participants for joining us today. And for those of you who are posting some questions, we really appreciate them. Why don't we begin with Pranash Aswis from the University of Texas at Arlington. He poses this question, which is, how do you get underrepresented minority students who are first generation without adult mentors brought into high impact practices? And he says at UTA, anytime we introduce a HIP into our institution, we normally see high performing students take advantage of them, but not the ones who need them most, the URM. So on that basic issue of access and how to do that best, what do you both think?
Well, I've already answered that question, at least to my mind. You build requirements into the curriculum, but there needs to be some front end work first. So institutions, I started out in admissions. I was a road runner for it was a little liberal arts college, but conversations about, in this point, opportunity is a word we can use, that these things exist. Students here do them. This institution prizes and values this, and you will have a chance to do this. Now, this has then to get funneled right into the advising sequence. If I were the czar of advising, I would not let any contact with the student go by without saying when. This is not an if question. This is when are we going to get you into X, Y, or Z? And if we can get that movement in the first year, of course, bundling or stitching this into a first year experience is optimum in my mind. And then we want to make sure the major fields are responsible for carrying through 2 or 3 or more. But you can't graduate. The SUNY system, now they, in their infinite wisdom, would not call them high impact practices. They call them applied learning experiences. But I mean, the governor and the chancellor of the SUNY system said, we're going to do this. And so they got all 64 campuses involved. So it is doable, top down, bottom up. But we got to have some levers early. And as I said, the advising function is very, very important here, as is people who are managing, tweaking, revising the curriculum. That's my sense.
And I'm going to say yes to everything you've said, so I don't need to repeat that. I would say a couple other things to say is that frequent and often, right? Being able to say this is for you, we mean everybody. But I also think leadership matters here, that we need to make sure that as institutions, we're valuing faculty doing undergraduate research and bringing students through, and making sure that we say that regularly, that the president and the provost and whoever is welcoming everybody at orientation, that faculty are able to be, understand that they can integrate their teaching and their research together and be valued in genuine excellence. Because if we don't have the faculty who are willing to work with the students and willing to put their time into building pedagogically important activities for students, then this kind of thing doesn't work, right? The students may come and be like, okay, I'm ready. We've said this is a thing we do. And then they need to be able to find the experiences when they get there. And one poor experience may take a student who heard about it, asked about it, and then we'll then turn them off. This is clearly not a thing for me. So we need to be really make sure that the entire institution is inclusive in our language, and then inclusive in the opportunities, I think is really important.
I mean, the faculty development support piece is huge. And I have heard from faculty who say, well, we're now requiring a research experience for all of our students.
Right.
And we're overrun. And there are students who need more mentorship assistance. And I'm not cutting this in any particular group-wise way. So the amount of pressure and time put on faculty, so innovative ways of working, getting research groups going. But that faculty development piece is huge, as you said.
Absolutely.
Well, that where you've just landed kind of dovetails with that next question that was upvoted in our Q&A, which is about faculty. We touched on university leadership. We've talked on the important role of advisors. But what, so we're saying it can be difficult for faculty. What could we say maybe a little more? Do we have any more concrete ideas about how we can assist faculty members and motivate them to incorporate high impact practices within their courses?
I really do. I think the faculty development, right? I was a faculty member and a department chair and in a Center for Teaching and Learning before I came in here. So I think I'm biased in those experiences, because I think that department chairs make an important role in helping, especially new faculty as they're coming in, create an integrated expectation rather than bubbles of your research is over here and your teaching is over here and service is over here, and rewarding it that way, but also not just expecting faculty who actually as we get new faculty coming to universities, many of them have participated in undergraduate research or came through systems where they were the active members, often the best of the people who came through high impact practices themselves. Like they loved college and now they're back in college, right? But being able to help them step back and see what the features are that make that important, and valuing it, and then giving the support to talk about it, in fact, in sort of new faculty orientations. I think those are all really fundamentally important, and making it easier as they're designing their classes and an expectation rather than an extra.
I want to sharpen your point about reward.
Yeah.
A vivid memory of sitting with a group of faculty and talking about the institution doesn't seem to reward this kind of work for promotion and tenure, for example.
Right.
And so my question back was, well, who's in charge of the promotion and tenure system? Well, the faculty are. There's the answer to the question. If we think this is important, we will tweak the P&T criteria in a way that privileges is too strong a word, but at least gives due common sense to this particular kind of activity.
Right. And I think that one of the things I work with my faculty about is this integration. One of the really nice things, especially as faculty are working on projects, is I always think of them as pocket projects, right? One of the nice things about working with undergraduates is that they don't need to have a dissertation topic with results that are publishable to be successful. The pedagogical aspects of being a part of a project within a class, individually, in a first-year program, is often valuable by itself. And so we've got a faculty member who is testing a whole bunch of antibiotics, potential antibiotics that come out of Gila monster mouths. And she takes a whole vast array of undergraduates at all levels and gives them each a compound and has them work away at testing it in the lab. It's a beautiful way. Most of those are going to turn out to be nothing. I had one student crying in my office one time because more bacteria grew rather than fewer bacteria growing. This may also be useful. But being able to think about how do you design projects that advance the faculty members' work and advance the students' experience, I think is a really, and that does come down to helping mentor faculty to be able to be working in teams like that and valuing it.
One other observation, and that is there is an additional talent pool out there, graduate students and upper division undergraduates who can, yeah, right. You kind of thinking scaffolding this with the grad students supervising the more advanced undergrads. By advanced, I mean, later in their studies. And then in those early years, first, second year of university, the senior student who's very, very good at this. We need to be, we need to do better at reaching out and capitalizing on those talent pools.
I totally agree. And I see there's a question, Steve, that I want to talk about, this shifting the conversation from the type of learning to the pedagogical qualities. And I think that's actually what George and I both have been talking about, rather than naming these, going to the features and thinking about how do you design if I'm working with faculty, that's one of the things I want to work with faculty on, are what are the features, what are the outcomes you want for your students, and what are the outcomes you want for you, and build whatever the experience is you're doing with, and that's going to look different in different disciplines, whether that's choreography or sampling trees or whatever your discipline, whatever your area, starting with what you want to have at the end and what you want your students to know and be able to do, rather than thinking about, well, I need to have one of these and one of these and one of these. The cumulative effect isn't because they got one of each thing. It's because they were able to see those different features reflected in different places during their academic career. They were valued in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And I just wanted to maybe interject that in the chat, Jessica pointed out the importance of representation throughout the university community, including kind of dovetails with George's point about the graduate students and advanced undergraduates and others who can serve as role models and provide that belonging that people need to feel in these areas of learning. So important. We thank Jessica for that observation. I think given the time.
Can I add one more thing? There is a paper that I have really been enamored of that came out recently about the University of Texas at El Paso and how well they've been doing at high impact practices, undergraduate research, but when you really read the paper, it's about integrated undergraduate research throughout their system, by Battaglia, Echegoyen and Diaz Martinez. And it really is a model of how this is a minority serving institution, a Hispanic serving institution. And I am enamored of this paper right now. I think it's really a nice example of how to do this and how to measure it in a way that gives you feedback for being better. So I wanted to plug that in because it integrates many of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, and I can plug UTEP all day and all night. They're featured at some length in the Boyer 2030 Commission report, which George referenced earlier, and which will be published this fall. And that's organized around the notion of the equity excellence imperative, and which will be the focus of that national conference I mentioned. Here at UERU, we're all about staying very much in touch with ideas, philosophical, positions and concepts, but linking them as best we can always to concrete practices on our campuses around the country, which often involves scaling or finding resources or being creative and innovative in ways so that we can reach all students effectively and create that kind of learning experience we're discussing today. So at this time, I think given time, we're going to be able to come back to George and Bethany a little bit later, we hope ideally. I'd like to transition to our campus partners now and briefly introduce them and invite them to elaborate a little bit in their introductions of themselves, because I think it's important who they are and where they're coming from, not just their institution and title. But we're gonna hear from Robert Bailey, the director of the College of Liberal Arts and Science, Learning Resources and interim coordinator of UF Student Success Tutoring and Academic Support at the University of Florida in Gainesville, of course. Then we'll transition from Rob to Allison Kroom, who's Associate Vice President and Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the University of South Florida, kind of sticking in the Sunshine State there early. Then we'll hear from Stephen Gerardo, who's Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Georgia Tech. And then fourth from Greg Heilman, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at the University of Arizona. And we'll finally come to the Northeast with Kate Zemer, Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of New Hampshire in Durham. And each of our colleagues is going to give us a little bit of an insight into how high impact practices are developing on their campuses, their respective campuses, with a focus on equity and how that plays out for us today. And then, like I said, we'll come back and see if George and Bethany have some concluding comments. So let me turn things over to Rob. Rob, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Great to be part of this really exciting conversation, especially here as we start to enter the beginning of a new year. It's always good to share these ideas to enthuse each other. I started with the goal of presenting what we're doing in terms of student success on our campus. Are you seeing my, let me make sure I'm giving you the right screen here. Are you seeing my slideshow now? Great.
Yes.
So my initial goal was to share with you what's happening in terms of student success here on campus, but my updated goal is to see if we can get on Professor Kuh's officially approved list, the tutoring aspect. I run a tutoring center. That's one of the reasons I have a headset on right now, because if I didn't, then I'd be overwhelmed with tutoring in the background. So I do tutoring for the coordination of tutoring for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, where we have 12,000 plus undergrads. Our university has 38,000 undergrads. So if you do the math there, it's about 32% of the students that we serve in the college in those courses. But we know that about 60% of the courses that we serve are in our top 38 historically difficult courses that I'll talk more about as we get to. That's not me there. That is DeWarren. He's one of our tutors, and that's what I hope to convince Professor Kuh of today. He may already be convinced of this, but that DeWarren's involvement as a tutor, to see him grow, is really the most impactful part of my job. I thought originally when I got into this some 20 odd years ago that it was watching the tutors help their peers, which still is a great thrill. But the real thing that I get out of this is watching the tutors grow, and I hope to share some of that with you today. So just going to look at the past a little bit. And back in the fall of 2019, we had our first Student Success Summit, where we brought together over 200 faculty, staff, and students around campus to talk about what student success is on our campus and what it means. We knew we were doing a lot of this work, but we really wanted to get the word out about what all the different units were doing. During the summit, our president, Kent Fox, emphasized the importance of relationships in attaining this. And so this collaboration really strives to nurture these meaningful relationships, especially for our undergraduates. Well, then shortly after we began this work, we're regularly convening with each other. Well, you all know what happened March of 2020. We recognized the need to reach out to our students even more emphatically to find out what they needed as they were all around the state, the country, and even internationally. And this feedback from our students was really high. They wanted to connect with some tutoring services and others. And so we recognized the need to really get this out. I'm really proud of our center. The students left our campus around March 16th, and by March 19th, our on-campus learning center had already stood up online tutoring. And then shortly afterwards, this is the real scaling challenge with any kind of academic support service, is trying to get this out to a lot of students. And so our vendor platform allowed us to really provide tutoring to larger pools of students. And we really wanted to include at least two specific groups here. We wanted to make sure we were covering the students who couldn't afford it, because we know if the pandemic exposed one thing, it was there wasn't going to be equal access to all kinds of things. And tutoring was one of those that we knew that students couldn't just reach out and pay out of pocket for. So we wanted to make sure we were providing tutoring to some of these students, and the vendor allowed us to do that. There's those top 38 C- CDO, what we call CDO courses here. Those 38, we also wanted to make sure that students that were enrolled in those were getting some subsidized tutoring. So we started to look at what kind of results we were getting out of that. Our student success data team, led by a data scientist, Aaron Thomas, he came up with a predictive model, and the results showed that tutoring was having a positive impact. But also to what we were talking about earlier, we wanted to we wanted to predict which students would need it versus those high achieving students who we know are going to use it, but we really wanted to identify the students who would need it. So the data led us to some conclusions here. Aaron was able to pull these figures out. Basically, this is saying of the 2,376 students who were identifying as in need of tutoring, that they are likely not to pass if they don't have some kind of intervention. For only 42% passed because they didn't take advantage of tutoring, whereas those that took advantage of tutoring, we had 52% pass. So you can see a significant positive correlation there. The next little bit of indicators of success here is that this is another form of group tutoring called supplemental instruction that really, that was what I was as a grad student. I know Steve was a supplemental instruction leader too. And just what we see here is the number of times the student comes to the study sessions, their grade's going to go up. That's not a big surprise. This is also in line with the national data. But right around here, if you come 11 or 13 to 15 times, you in general score about a letter grade higher than people who don't utilize this service at all. So that was some data that informed our decisions about our approaches. What we're also doing is making intentional collaborations with our campus partners, making sure that everybody around knows what we're doing here. We are hiring an associate dean to lead this endeavor. We've already hired another data scientist to be on the team, and we're planning for additional staff. And then my goal in the future is to look at tutoring as a high impact practice. How can we really plug it in? And to Bethany and George's points earlier, if we can put this in the curriculum, embedding this, what we, our emphasis here is called experiential learning. So if we can get that embedded into our general education curriculum called UF Quest, we think that that's going to be a really high impact practice for students like DeWarren. We also are considering the potential of partnering with our local schools to get out in the communities, and that would be some service and community-based learning opportunities. And then the thing that I'm really focused on is recruiting tutors from our TRIO and SSS programs, because I just really feel like if the students who are using these services see students who come from the similar backgrounds as them, they're more likely to attend these services, and we're trying to really destigmatize tutoring. So there's a few links for some of the things that I talked about, and I will turn this back over to my panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. That's awfully great of you to share that. We really appreciate it. Let's transition over. We'll go from Gainesville over to Tampa, where we find Allison.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Great to spend some time with you all, and here I'm learning and excited to be part of the conversation. At the University of South Florida around 2016, 2015, we embarked on a new quality enhancement plan for our SACS accreditation, and we selected the Global Citizens Project. And at the same time, we were going through a new Gen Ed curriculum initiative to have an enhanced Gen Ed. And we really focused in on those high impact practices, what you heard earlier being discussed, and talking about the capstone and the mandatory experience, working with our advisors on that. And so as we worked on the quality enhancement plan and talked about global citizens, we discussed quite a lot about equity and access for our students who may not otherwise be able to participate in intercultural competence activities and programs. And a lot of those have been study abroad. And so what we're able to do is, by working directly with faculty through incentives, is develop curriculum that's embedded in the programs across all of the academic colleges where students are already taking those courses to have a global experience. And we've had such success with that, over 90 different programs across the 3 campuses here at USF, that we've been able to just continue to build on that. And then with the pandemic, realized we needed to do something a little bit more. And we heard Bethany talk about grand challenges. We partnered with the University of Exeter to create a virtual grand challenge, Operation Global Action here at USF, that we launched in spring 2020. And that's continued to grow. And actually the students have been able to participate that in the summer. And we've had quite a bit of an increase for our students that otherwise weren't involved in those opportunities and experiences. And so ramping that up, we've seen quite a bit of growth in all of those areas of high impact practices that have been mentioned before. And certainly I took note of George's new one, that not new, but different way of thinking of inquiry and creative activity. I'm going to start using that. And high impact practices undergraduate research department to take what we saw work with Global Citizens Project and scale that up. And so we're using that same strategy of working directly with the faculty to have courses that cover over the different high impact practices, focusing on undergraduate research from the very beginning, using what we've seen successful there with Operation Global Action in the summer for undergraduate research experiences, and really seeing a lot of traction across the colleges in community engaged learning and internships. And that all started with that initial program of Global Citizens. And now we've been able to embed that across, and are looking forward to the future and what that's going to be. So very exciting times, and definitely look forward to being able to share back with you all on how we've grown beyond GCP.
Thank you, Allison. Really appreciate that check-in on a very traditional and profoundly important high impact practice for sure. Sticking in the southeast of the United States, we move up I-75 to Atlanta, and Stephen Gerardo at Georgia Tech. Stephen.
Can y'all see my slide? Ask you to start your, okay, let's see. Can everybody see my slides? Can you see my slides?
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode though.
Oh, let me put it in present. Mariah gave me, okay, there we go. All right, well, thank you and welcome, and yeah, greetings from Atlanta, up the street here from my colleagues down in Florida, but equally as hot and humid, I'm quite sure. Stephen Gerardo, I'm Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, and I'm just gonna give kind of a broad overview of how we're approaching high impact practices at Georgia Tech. And this is a really timely conversation at Tech as we embark on we're in the midst of the beginning of a strategic plan, about 2 years in. And also my colleagues in Florida have both mentioned QEPs. Georgia Tech is at the beginning stage of looking ahead at our next QEP. Will be going up for our 10-year reaffirmation. And interestingly enough, our past 2 QEPs at Georgia Tech, we were one of the first schools that had the QEP, but have led to a number of high impact practices at Tech. Our first, back in 2004, led to both service learning and, international study abroad, as well as undergraduate research. Our second QEP that we just finished, turned in our 5-year report last year, really led to an expansion in service learning and community-based learning. It was called Serve, Learn, Sustain. So our next one, is likely going to head in that direction. This is a quote that is directly from our strategic plan. And you heard George mention the word all students, or in the earlier conversation. You can see that language is very intentional in the discussion, where we want to provide all students with transformative learning experiences, is the phrase that we've resonated on in our strategic plan. Students to grow as ethical, globally aware, sophisticated leaders who can define and solve problems to improve the human condition. Now, full disclosure, the picture on the left there, I'm actually sitting in the airport of Atlanta right now and about to get on a flight to Oxford, England. So please hope that Heathrow has solved some of its problems. I don't think it's going. But the picture on the left there is actually a picture last year of our new program that we started. I've helped start our first year semester abroad program, where we have students that will start their first year experience with a global component. And I know many of your campuses have these because I looked at some of the models out there. This is our campus in France, in Metz, France. And I actually got a chance last year to go visit the students. There are about 40 students. Taking a picture there, you can see they're all masked up because mask restrictions were pretty tight back then in 2021. This year we added a second track to our program where students can go either to Oxford, England. We don't have a campus there, but we have a very successful summer program there. And another half are going back over to Metz, France. So we have about 50 total students, about 100 students total that are doing that. And the nice thing about the program is they spent 3 weeks in Atlanta. They're just finishing it up this week, taking 3 credit hours, 1 a health class and 1 our freshman seminar, first year seminar, to prepare them both for learning about our campus in Atlanta, but we also embedded global education into that. So I think it's an interesting intersection of high impact practices if you think about first year experience, study abroad, and we also embedded other activities, experiential learning, even within those 2 courses. So my colleagues here in the airport lounge are also getting a chance to hear all about Georgia Tech's high impact practices. So I'm trying to be respectful, but they may find it interesting. I'm in a quiet corner. Let's see, let me move this slide. Oh. So this is a selection of kind of the portfolio. Georgia Tech really prides itself, our founding educational philosophy, which we share at first year orientation, is hand in mind, learning by doing. And my predecessor, Colin Potts, who many of you know, which shows students a photo dating back to 1899, which showed the academic building. We call it the Tech Tower today, and it's the oldest building on campus. And right next door, the shop building, where students would go from what they were learning in the academic building and go next door to the shop building and apply that. And so today, the shop building is what we call terms like high impact practices or experiential learning. And there are a number of programs. So we're known for our co-op program and internship program. Serve, Learn, Sustain was our QEP, as I mentioned. Undergraduate Research. First QEP, we were back when QEPs didn't have to be just one, they could be multiple things. So we had undergraduate research and what we call the international plan. But that led to a proliferation of undergraduate research on our campus, or at least a proliferation, I'll say, of the coordination and advancement of undergraduate research, because that was already going on before we had a QEP and certainly has continued to grow, but we've provided infrastructure and a support network for it. Our first year seminar, GT 1000, and we've added a transfer year seminar. Transfer students are an important population that we're having a lot of conversations on now. Study abroad, and then learning communities. We have a first year learning, we used to call them living learning communities, but we've branched the model out. So it's not, all of them are not only gonna have a living component, some of them may be learning communities that don't necessarily have a residential requirement. And in terms of that conversation around equity and access, when you start tacking in things like you have to be in a residence hall, I mean, the majority of our undergraduates first years do live in a residence hall, but as you go beyond that, not having that additional cost, but yet still being able to provide a community-based experience, I think is important. So we're adding some different learning communities that don't necessarily have that. I just wanted to summarize briefly on some things that we are talking about. As I mentioned, high impact practices or transformative learning experiences are very much a part of our strategic plan, and our new Senior Vice Provost for Education and Learning at Georgia Tech is leading a task force that I'm on, where we're looking at this concept of transforming teaching and learning. And really inherent to that is looking at equity and access to HIPS by removing financial barriers, financial and other barriers, things as simple as fee waivers and things that we can find money for scholarships, to remove those kinds of barriers for students to be able to engage and participate. Lots of conversation during this session about how to increase engagement in HIPS, not as in addition to or experience on top of their experiences, but embedded within the undergraduate curriculum. That's something we're talking about. In my office, I'm looking at organizational structures. I'm newish into this role, and we're looking at how can we provide more campus leadership, not to do it all, not to take all the HIPS and put them in one big mega unit. That would never work at my campus, nor many of yours, I'm sure. But how can we provide more dedicated strategic leadership to HIPS, help and partner with faculty to create them, enhance them, expand them. And also, I love the data topic in the first session on the tutoring. I come from a background running tutoring and academic support too, so really resonated with that talk. But how do we better capture institute level outcomes of HIPS? So a lot of our programs look at their program level data, they look at their outcomes, they do grade assessment plans, but how do we capture that at the institute level? How can we create meta outcomes around student experience in HIPS? If they do, George talked about multiple HIP experiences and how that leads to even greater efficiencies. How do we actually quantify that? And I'd love to see, some of you are probably doing that very well. Talked about faculty like you. We're thinking of faculty are busy. They've got a lot on their plates, especially in R1. How can we support them? How can we remove the barriers for them to get involved creating and developing both experiential learning and HIPS in their classes, in their curriculum, and also co-curricular HIPS as well. And then scaling HIPS to reach more students using technology. So there's two examples there. Like some of the other campuses, and we've engaged. We're piloting NAC. When I know one of the software sponsors of this in the conference, so I'm not a spokesperson for NAC, but we're working with them to try piloting online tutoring. We all learned the value and the need for that during COVID. But also it removes barriers for students to be able to engage in tutoring, especially when they can't come on campus, say for between 9 and 6, when our in-campus tutoring tends to be offered. And then we're also using an initiative. We've partnered with Mentor Collective on a mentoring initiative for our first-gen students that's in its first year. And so both of those are examples of using technology platforms to help scale and expand, although technically not on the ACU and list necessarily, but I certainly do consider those high impact educational practices. So I'll stop there and look forward to the follow-up questions and the rest of the panel. Thank you, everybody.
Stephen, on behalf of all of us, thank you for taking time at the airport to be a part of this town hall. We really appreciate it. And I have good news for you. While you were speaking, I checked the temperature in London. It's 76 Fahrenheit. And, so that sounds pretty good. And the runway that melted there was at Luton, not at Heathrow. So I really think you're in great shape. The bad news is that in Tucson, Arizona, I also checked the temperature right now. And Greg, it's 92 degrees outside. So I'd stay right where you're at.
And humid. We've got the monsoons in force right now. So can you hear me okay? Let me see. I don't see you right now.
Yes. And the screen looks good.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you, UERU and Steve, for this town hall, and Bethany for the wonderful setup, and to the other panelists. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how the curricula and high impact practices intersect. And I think this is quite interesting with a focus on equity. We actually have a grant through UERU that is looking at this topic, and I know that perhaps some of you are involved in that research as well. The three previous panelists all mentioned integrating high impact practices into the curricula. One in the case of tutoring, and Stephen also mentioned trying to find how to get these high impact practices into curricula. And I think we're all doing them. We're all trying to do high impact practices on our campus. Probably everyone that I saw George's list, I think we're doing them. It's a matter of how well are we doing them. And the other question that George brought up is, are we ensuring that everyone is having equal access to those high impact practices? And if you have a highly complex, it's difficult to integrate yet more into it. And so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. The first thing I want to note, however, is that when George was talking about the high impact practices, that he's been able to show through extensive study that it has an impact on a student's ability to succeed in higher education. And it's a probabilistic model that was created that showed on average, it's going to increase student success. Probabilistic about completing the curriculum, however, you can do every high impact practice there, but if you don't complete the curriculum, you don't earn the degree. And vice versa, if you do none of them, but you complete the curriculum, you're going to get the degree. Now we know that it's going to improve your chances of succeeding if you do them, but underlying all of this is this central element that you have to complete the degree program. And so anything you do, every student success metric that we create is tied to student progression. Are they progressing towards receiving that all-important credential that opens up the American dream, essentially? And so let's take a quick look at what a curriculum looks like. And by the way, for first-generation students, there's not just this curriculum, there's also something that we call the hidden curriculum that's out there, that they also have to understand how you traverse this hidden curriculum. So this is just an arrangement of the courses in a curriculum that a student must progress through, along with the prerequisite relationships between those courses in this curriculum. And if I one, we all know that's, this is the one that if you're going to do tutoring as a high impact practice, put it there, because it's going to change more in higher education than anything. You'll see at this engineering program, it's blocking 10 other courses in the curriculum. Those green courses, you can't take those courses until you pass this calculus course. And there's a blue line that's a long path through this curriculum. Long pathways in curricula tend to cause difficulties for students. So maybe thinking about where you're placing these high impact practices with really matter. In particular, I might suggest that calculus is a good place to try and integrate them if there's even room to do that. Now, there's a most central course in this curriculum. This is an electrical engineering curriculum. It's my discipline, so I picked this one. Always, no matter what curricula you look at across the country, that's the most central course in an electrical engineering curriculum. Now, I'm showing you an identically accredited program at a different institution that has a curricular complexity score that's based on those metrics that I just showed you. How many courses are blocked? How many long pathways are there in your curriculum? This one's about 5 times more complex to get to the same ABET learning outcomes. Same outcomes, but dramatically different curricula. What is that all about? I would venture to say that it would be very difficult to fit high impact practices into this curricula, given everything else that's going on there. So there's blocked by calculus in this curriculum, and there's a path of length 12 in this curriculum. So dramatically different. Why is that? And who is this impacting? Where is the equity associated with this, right? And also, if you are a disadvantaged student who may not be coming to this as a calculus-ready student, the hidden curriculum that you're trying to complete is far more complex than even this. And why does this matter? Well, as HIPs are all about curricular complexity also impacts student success. This was some work done by a colleague of Steve and ours at Utah State University, Mitchell Culver, who showed that the 4-year graduation rate drops fairly precipitously as students try to complete the more high complexity programs. 6-year graduation rate, same thing. He showed the same for, and that was for time to degree. He showed the same for first-time, full-time cohorts in terms of 4-, 5-, and 6-year graduation rates. A 50% change, a 50-point change in curricular complexity score, you're losing about 10 percentage points in your 4-year graduation rate. So just to put this in the bigger context of why this matters, I kind of went all the way back to Vincent Tinto's work on why people leave college, and he framed this in terms of this incongruence between a student and the institution needs, preferences, and interests. And in Tinto's model, there were 2 parts to this system. Up above, there's this academic system, and then there's the social system. And this is the academic system. And the way he framed it is, let's look at just grades and intellectual development. But I'm posing there's something more important here. There's an equity aspect to who gets to study what subject, because the jobs that you get are quite different. We all know that if you manipulate the input, you can improve right? Everyone's going to do better, HIPs or none, to your institution. And a lot of places have improved their performance just based on that. And then this is where this I think high impact practices is really this bridge between the academic and the social in many cases. It really makes the student feel like they belong at the institution. And so our research is trying to understand how these two might be linked, how high impact practices and the curriculum influence student progression. I'd like to just make this last point that the biggest issue perhaps now in higher education isn't maybe as much access or affordability. It's who gets to succeed in what majors. And if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you'll see that most of these jobs that are projected for the next 10 years are in STEM related discipline that have highly complex curricula. And if you look at the pay on over here for nurse practitioners, data scientists, physician's assistants, quite different from home and healthcare aides. And the training required to get these is quite different as well. And so does the curriculum itself provide a barrier to equity in higher education? And here's a quick demonstration of this. Here is an engineering curriculum that has moderate complexity. But if you take a first generation student who maybe didn't go to a high school where calculus was provided, the act they're trying to surmount is hundreds of points more complex than the one that the school is handing out to most students. In fact, they generally don't even provide this map to those students. And if you look at the complexity, the long pathways in this thing, it's a very difficult thing. And if you extract from this pattern that is in every engineering curricula, it's how do you get to circuits? If you get to circuits and can pass circuits, you're going to be an electrical engineer. But if I tack on all of these requisite math classes, you're doubling the complexity of what the student has to confront. You could add high impact practices to this, and I'll show you an effective way of doing that. An effective way of doing that is let's create a high impact first engineering course where we put the sense of belonging, we build that into this first course, and we make sure that the student understands that they belong in this no matter where they came from. All you have to do is move one learning outcome in the curriculum that was in this course, and you can now take circuits 1 and the 3rd term with your classmates who came at the same time, calc ready. That's an equitable solution to this problem that's precluding engineers from certain demographic groups from progressing in higher education. And so this is an instance of where you could create a high impact targeted practice that matters in this curriculum and could change equitable outcomes in higher education. When you simply tell you, it was implemented at Wright State University and subsequently at many places around the country. If you do that first course as a high impact practice, almost everyone succeeds. 98% of the people will be able to complete this program versus only 79% of this little pattern if you don't have that high impact practice in place. Last thing I'd like to mention is I was recently at a conference with, and Mary Murphy presented the bureaucratic hassle that leads many first generation students to feel less of a sense of belonging in higher education. And one of the experiments that they showed is that if you present someone with a first generation student, right? So this is a stereotype threat issue taking place. If you show them a highly complex curriculum and a simpler curricula, those students who are experiencing the simpler curricula feel more of a sense of belonging to the institution. So again, this is a targeted threat that happens to first generation students when they confront. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for the mention of Mary Murphy, who will be joined by Claude Steele, her colleague, for a conversation at our national conference on November 16th, to be specific. So, no, 15th. So a nice plug for our national conference and Dr. Murphy's work. Well, for the millionth time in her life, exactly, Kate Zemer will be last now to present from the University of New Hampshire. Kate, thanks so much for your patience. We so appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, so thank you, Steve. My name is Kate Zemer. I am the Senior Vice Provost of Academic Affairs at UNH, and I am very pleased to be part of this discussion, as well as hopefully some ongoing discussions with this group about high impact practices. My role at UNH means that I'm focusing on ensuring that the students get the learning with the experience and facing the challenge of how to scale up not only the access to these experiences, but the ways in which we can determine that the students are getting the learning and not just having the experience. And this topic is especially important to me personally because of my more sort of non-traditional career path. I'm actually a chemical engineer by training. I graduated with my BS in chemical engineering from Virginia Tech in the late 80s, so prime time for chemies. Went to work for DuPont in Victoria, Texas at a nylon intermediates production facility. And I told my family at that time I never wanted to step foot on a college campus again. I worked as a process engineer for 7 years, and despite of what I am sure were the best efforts of my Virginia Tech faculty, I really didn't understand what chemical engineering was until I was working for DuPont. The potential of the field, the ways it could really impact important problems in the world, everything from that to the simple day-to-day responsibilities of being an engineer, that I learned working for DuPont. So despite the offer to support my PhD work at University of Delaware, I quit a perfectly good job and went to graduate school with the goal of becoming a chemical engineering professor. I wanted my students to connect what they were learning more directly to the things they care about. I wanted to use my experiences to help them understand what being an engineering professional really was and the skills it really takes to have an impact. So after earning my PhD, I went to teach and do research at Northeastern University. And I chose Northeastern because of the integrated co-op program where students were in school for 6 months and then work for 6 months. Now, I know this audience is not surprised to know that it's not just as simple as having a co-op programming and scheduling classes to facilitate a year-round 6-month work, 6-month class kind of environment to ensure the impacts of high impact practices. The key is to provide enough scaffolding for the students that they recognize the skills they are acquiring, that they can articulate the learning and transfer from the classroom setting to the workplace setting and vice versa, ensuring the reflection on learning so they don't have the experience and miss the learning. One of my favorite examples of this was talking to a student who said how great their co-op was because they learned to use Excel. And it took a lot of discussion with her to get her to articulate how using Excel enabled her to analyze data from different sources under different assumptions, and how critical the source of that information was to the eventual analysis. And then to get her to say not how just using Excel was a skill she acquired, but she was also just as valuable to learn how to be able to articulate that analysis process and how the awareness of the importance of the source of information was going to help her in her upcoming courses and in her career as an engineer. So like many of you, I am always looking at making sure high impact practices are accessible to all students and making sure students recognizing the learning from them. So how do we scale this up at a Research One university where faculty have 1,000,000,005 things to do, and everybody can appreciate the value of a high impact practice? So at UNH, we have a very active undergraduate research center and the first year seminars, and lots of great stuff we can learn from all of you, and we're doing some good stuff too. And where that assessment and where that ensuring that our students are gaining that learning is easiest to get our hands around is when it is integrated in the curricula for a capstone, for example, or integrated in an academic activity where you do things like present your research finding at the Undergraduate Research Conference, when you do your research for credit. But I believe that a big part of ensuring access to high impact practices is to help students capitalize on the learning in the activities they are already doing through clubs, through work study, through volunteering, through tutoring, through part-time jobs. So we are looking at ways of helping our students to tie what they're learning in these activities into transferable skills to help them be successful in their chosen career. So we're looking at building on badging programs that we use through our professional development extension offices. We have taken a look at, we are using NAC, and Steve, and I'd be happy to chat with you about our success in enabling that, not only from helping our tutors recognize what they are learning to become tutors, but also the impact we're having on expanding the reach of our tutoring to other students at the university who can't come to that tutoring center that's only open from 9 to 3. The next thing we're trying to do is build a culture of all of our employees are educators. So when you have a work study, can we give a really simple 2 or 3 question questionnaire to the supervisor to help that work study student reflect on what they're doing and how it relates to their particular career goals. So I know we're sensitive on time, Steve, so I'm going to stop there. But thank you again very much, everyone, and I'd love to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Kate. This is terrific. What a great set of reports from just 5 of our member campuses. And you can imagine all the different experiences people are having across diverse institutions, all of which are research universities, but have their each distinctive character and set of issues. We do have just a few minutes. George, I invite you if you'd like to make a quick comment, and Bethany as well.
I have no quick comments. I'd like to comment on everything that's been said, which was really overwhelmingly instructive for me. Let me just bookend this. Robert Bailey started. George, why don't you declare peer tutoring to be a HIP? I kind of done that, but I want to say that we are working through NAC with Nessie, which has field tested a number of items. So we may have some data that will edge us toward that, Robert. And then just, as I said, I've got things to say about everyone, but let me just finish with Kate, who I'd like, frankly, to hear more from. I mean, you hammered it right home. Reflection, can you get students to articulate what in the world is going on with them? We can best do this with that last HIP, that e-portfolio. We didn't talk much about that, but if we all instituted e-portfolio in our work, we'd discern a lot more impact from undergraduate research and others. And finally, Kate, you may know what the University of Iowa has done in terms of trying to tease out the learning from the work experience. If not, I invite everybody to go to the Iowa website and just type in all caps GROW. They have been doing terrific work there for about a dozen years, helping supervisors and students themselves discern the meaning and the impact and learning about campus work.
Thanks.
Bethany?
And I would just say, I know we're hitting on time. I just want to say that I want to wrap back around the idea that what's most important about all these experiences we've been hearing about, and I want to talk to everybody. I can't wait for the conference to be able to learn more about what everybody's doing. But if we look at what you're all doing, I think, first of all, the future is bright for high impact practices, but also the idea that it's the features of the high impact practices, the values we're trying to do. And if we're designing from that perspective, then we're doing the right thing. And I think that our students are all benefiting, but I think keeping that thoughtfulness in terms of equity in mind will be really important for us. And also, I'm going to give a plug for the QEP. Clearly, all of us who are in the southern states, really the QEP has given us a launch pad for, that was ours too, right, for doing high impact practices. And I think they really have benefited from something we often thought was a pain. And so I think it is really nice to see how much that's come to fruition.
Agreed.
On behalf of the 105 UERU Research University members, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our home office team for supporting this town hall. And I want to especially thank over 300 people who joined us today for this conversation. It is recorded. We will post it. We'll let you all know when that's available. And this conversation has just begun with lots more to come. So thank you all. Best wishes for the rest of your day and for the beginning of your fall semesters. Thank you.
Well, good to be with you.